What is up, harvesters? Welcome back to my subscribers, and if you're new here, welcome. My name is Ken. So today I want to talk to you guys about how we're going to get your food plots ready to go for the summer planting season so that we have those nice standing food plots come the fall hunting season. So I'm going to teach you how to do this a couple different ways. I'm going to teach you how to do it with chemicals, which a lot of guys call like the no-till method. I'm also going to teach you how we can do this without chemicals if you don't want to use chemicals. And then I'm also going to teach you what I do, which is sort of like a mix of everything. So first off, I would just want to quickly go over, well, what if you don't even have your food plots in yet? What if you're a first timer, you're putting in a new food plot? Let's just quickly go over the things you're going to need to do first before we get into these other steps. So when you're putting in a food plot for the first time, the thing you need to be worried about, of course, is your sun and your soil. So first off, if you're where there's like high canopy trees, we need to open those up. We need to get sunlight down to that food plot for as many hours of the day as possible. Ideally, every hour of the day there is sun hitting that food plot. So once we've done that, we need to get that soil right. So you're going to want to get a soil test regardless of which stage you're at here, how many years you've been doing a food plot. Always get that soil test every year, but you're going to want to do that up front in a first year food plot because we might have a lot more work to do at getting that soil right than you will if you've had an established food plot for years and years. So the other thing is, this ground may have never been worked before, especially if you're putting this in the woods or something. This isn't just like a field edge that you're making a food plot this year. You're going to want to get in there. I do recommend using some sort of equipment to level the dirt off just a little bit if this isn't a level place in the woods or wherever you are. But the other thing is you want to bust up that old turf. So I've had this issue on my southeastern Wisconsin food plot when I was getting that established. There was a lot of turf in there, so I had to get that turf busted up because even just spraying, trying to do the no-till method wasn't really working because there was just such a thick nap of like turf that I had to get busted up in order to get that nice seed to soil contact. So I do highly recommend getting in there, get a leaf blower in there, just blow everything out if you can. Also, though, get some equipment in there if you can, or just a rake. A rake works too, a metal rake, and just bust up that very top layer of soil. Kind of fill in your low spots, knock down those high spots if you can, and you should be ready to go. And now we can get on to how we get our food plots ideally ready for that summer planting season. So first off, I'm going to go over the chemical no-till method, and if you guys don't want to use chemicals, you don't have to. I'll get into that part later in this video. But if you are decided on you do want to use chemicals, and I do highly recommend using chemicals if this is a newer food plot. Once you have a more established food plot, you need less chemicals typically. But I do highly recommend that if you're just starting out, if this is a new food plot, we definitely want to consider using these chemicals because they can be very useful to getting a nice weed-free food plot. And then once you have that established, you don't have to use so many chemicals or any chemicals at all years down the road after you've been working this land as a food plot for years and years and years. So first of all, I want to get into what we spray when we're doing this. So I use glyphosate, which is just the generic name for Roundup, and I also use 2,4-D. Now, glyphosate is used to primarily kill off your grasses, although it will harm anything it touches. So be sure when you're spraying this stuff, you're not getting it on like any shrubs or maybe switchgrass or anything else you're trying to establish. But for the most part, this is going to just really kill off those grasses that are growing in your plots, and it will harm the other things, but the other things like your broadleaves are going to be handled a lot better with the 2,4-D, so that's why I use that as well. Now you can mix these together when you spray them, so you don't have to spray them separately. And I apply glyphosate at 2 quarts per acre, and I apply 2,4-D at 1 pint per acre. And then you just mix that with your water. And a lot of guys are always like, well, how much water do I need? Well, the amount of water you mix with the chemical is based on the spray rate of your sprayer. So you can actually like look at the spray rate of your sprayer, try to do all the math, try to figure out that the exact last drop out of that sprayer sprays on the last part of your food plot, that you're traveling at the exact right miles per hour while you're applying it, and so on. Or you can just do what I do. I make sure I put more than enough water in my tank to cover the entire plot at least one time. Then once I've covered it one time with spray, I look at what's left in the tank. And if I'm at about, say, 50% full, I know that I can spray the whole plot again at the exact same speed that I just traveled. Or if there's less or there's more, you just adjust based on that. So you go a little faster, you go a little slower. Maybe there's certain parts of your plot have more growth than the others. So maybe you just make sure you hit up those areas twice and you don't actually get a complete even spraying across your food plots. But that's just what I do, is I make sure I can spray the whole thing at least once, and then with whatever's left, I just adjust to kind of make that cover the plot again, so that at least the entire plot gets sprayed one time. Even if it's not at the maximum dosage or maximum rate, it'll at least have something sprayed on it. And that is a lot easier than trying to like perfectly keep that speedometer where it's supposed to be. Make sure you're not overlapping sprays on passes. That can get very, very difficult, especially with food plots that aren't like perfect rectangles or something. Like I always talk about having food plots in like weird shapes like boomerangs or snake shapes because of how that affects the deer herd, but that makes it really hard to make sure you're getting an absolute even spraying on them. So I just do that, make sure you're covering them all, and then just adjust on that second pass. So, okay, we decided we want to spray. So when do we spray? How often do we spray? What are all the details, right? So, okay, I'm going to tell you guys an actual step-by-step for this year's calendar of how I would do spraying for myself if I was going to stick with this 100% no-till method. And so the first thing we want to consider is you want to spray at least 3 times. 3 times is ideal, especially if this is a newer food plot or you just do have a lot of noxious growth in your food plot. But those 3 sprayings are going to want to be spaced out like 2 to 3 weeks between spraying. So the idea there is that you spray once, it gives all that stuff a chance to die, and then some other stuff might pop up, and that gives it a chance to pop up after that other stuff's been cleared. You then handle that stuff. More stuff might pop up. Again, you handle that stuff, and you should have a weed-free plot headed into the planting season. Now, by all means, keep an eye on this. I am not saying you have to spray a 3rd time if you're spraying nothing but dirt in your plot. If those first 2 sprayings, or maybe even that first spraying, once you've been doing this a few years and these food plots are a few years old, you may only need that 1 spraying. And so just kind of keep an eye on it. Don't think that, hey, he told me to spray 3 times, I have to spray 3 times. No, just keep an eye on it, see what you need. Maybe you don't even need both chemicals. You may only need the glyphosate if it's only grasses coming up. You may only need the 2,4-D if it's broadleaves. But also on that 3rd spraying, and I'll get into this when I get into the actual schedule of doing this, you may want to omit that 2,4-D out of that 3rd spraying, because when you spray glyphosate, as soon as it hits the ground, it basically neutralizes it, and it doesn't have any lasting effect. So if something were to germinate the day after you sprayed glyphosate, that glyphosate doesn't actually do anything to it. So you would have to spray again to get anything that germinated after that spraying of glyphosate. But 2,4-D does stay in your soil for about 2 weeks. So you don't want to plant at least 2 weeks after you spray 2,4-D. So just depending on when your plant date is, consider omitting that 2,4-D out of that last spraying. So, all right, let's get into this year's schedule. So I am going to base this schedule based on using a summer cover crop of buckwheat. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later in the video. But if you are planning on using a summer cover crop of buckwheat, this is what your timeline is going to be. If you are not, you can just bump this back the 6 to 7 weeks that buckwheat will be growing as a summer cover crop. But this is why I'm trying to get this video out to you guys now, because this first spraying time is coming up really quickly here. So we're going to want to spray our first time about April 22nd. I'm going to use the Saturdays because I figure you guys probably, this isn't your full-time job. It's not my full-time job. So we're going to have to be using these weekends most likely. So I'm going to use the Saturdays, of course, adjust to whenever you have your own free time. But that first spraying, we're going to want to focus on about April 22nd. And now this is going to be ideally set up for about the Wisconsin area of the country, because that's where I am. So of course, extend that off east and west across the country. If you're further north, you actually want to start this sooner. And I know you guys are sitting with a lot of snow still on the ground. So you're like, listen, guy, I can't spray. I don't have anything growing right now. I have snow. I'm not spraying my snow. And again, just adjust for your specific situation. You may skip that summer cover crop this year up on the northern part of the country in that snow belt where you guys still have quite a bit of snow on the ground. Hopefully that's going to be melting here this week. The weather is supposed to be a lot warmer. You guys should be right behind us on spring green up. We're just hitting it right now here in the southern part of the state. So, all right. First off, we're going to target that April 22nd spray date. So this is our first spraying. Everything should be greened up by then and leafed out. You don't want to just hit it immediately when it pops out of the ground. You want it to be mature enough that you can actually get like a decent amount of chemical on the plant so that you really get a solid kill. Now, I'm going to use a 3-week span here. You can, of course, do 2 weeks instead, especially if you're further north. You're trying to fit this into a tighter window. You have a shorter growing season. And, of course, if you're down south, you can expand this out even further. You can start earlier. You can start later. You guys are really dealing with like 2 growing seasons down there compared to what we have up here in the north. But this is your overall spacing that I'm going to get into. So just kind of use that as a broad outline and then adjust accordingly for where you specifically are in your specific situation. So, all right, April 22nd is our first spray date. That puts 3 weeks after that at May 13th for our second spray date. Now, 3 weeks after that, we're into June 3rd. And so then once we hit June 3rd, that's that third spraying. So you may not want to spray that 2,4-D in that spraying. Now, 3 weeks after that, this is when we're going to plant that summer cover crop. If you want to plant buckwheat as a summer cover crop, it gives you a solid 6 to 7 weeks of it out competing everything in your food plot. You don't have to worry about spraying chemicals because it's just out there naturally choking out everything else. And then when we ultimately terminate it, it acts as a green manure and puts nutrients back into the soil. So it's a really good way of like building your soil, but also keeping it weed free without chemicals. Now, if we were going to skip this step, we would have just bumped these 3 spray dates like 6-7 weeks into the future instead of starting back in April. So you're going to let that buckwheat grow for about 6 to 7 weeks. That is going to get you to about August 5th to the 12th. So that is when we're targeting planting our fall focused food plots. So the northern part of Wisconsin, I like to target more the beginning of August. The southern part of Wisconsin, I like to target more like the 2nd or 3rd week of August. But just keep in mind if you are using buckwheat as a summer cover crop to make sure that gets planted 6 to 7 weeks before your fall plant date, because if you let it go too long, it'll go to seed and you're going to plant buckwheat with your fall focused forage mixes, and you don't want to do that because it's going to throw off your mixes. So just make sure you're staying true to that 6 to 7 weeks before your fall plant date of your plant date of your buckwheat if you want to do that. And if you don't want to do that, again, you can just adjust those 3 sprayings up in front of this fall focused plant date. And so the reason why we target this August planting is, this might be new for some of you, but the reason why we do this is we aren't worried about harvesting these crops when we plant them. If that was the case, we'd plant when the farmers plant. But what we want is those plants to be at their tenderest, juiciest, highest attraction to the deer herd during the hunting season. So we plant them in August. They are nice, young, tender, juicy, green piece of candy out there in the woods for the deer. When all the other crops have been growing all summer, they're mature, they're starting to dry out, and we have that high level focused food attraction in the woods for that deer herd so that we can put the deer exactly where we want them to be. So that pretty much wraps up the no-till method. Now, when you do terminate that buckwheat, you can spray it with glyphosate. If for whatever reason it didn't completely choke out everything else on your plot and you did have some weeds growing, you can use glyphosate there during that plant time of that fall-focused seed. That is just your last spraying. Do not use 2,4-D there. Like I said, that's going to sit in the soil for 2 weeks and you just threw down your seed. You do not want that. So just glyphosate only, and it's not always necessary. But let's get into how we're going to do this if we don't want to use chemicals at all. So when we don't want to use chemicals, we have to do tilling, plowing, disking, cultivating, even using a drag harrow. So when we want to try to get a food plot established without using chemicals, we need to turn that dirt over mechanically several times until all of those seeds are worked to the surface. They germinate, we turn the soil again, we get more seeds to the surface, we turn the soil again. We just keep turning that soil over and over and over again until all of the noxious weed seeds that have laid dormant in that soil have come to the surface, have grown, and then we terminate them again by just continually rolling that soil over and over and over again. Now, depending on where you're at, if you're trying to set up a food plot in an existing farm field that's been worked for generations, this is probably pretty easy for you. You may only have to turn it over one time and you're good to go. But now, if you're trying to establish a first year food plot somewhere that's never been worked before, this is going to end up being a lot of work for you. You're going to have to work this soil a lot to get it established without using chemicals, which is why I said earlier in the video that I do highly recommend using chemicals if this is a first year food plot. And then as you get into like later years of this being a food plot, you don't have to use as many chemicals because these mechanical ways will help to reduce your chemical costs by being able to just keep those plots weed free heading into the fall planting season. So again, you're going to want to do this every 2 to 3 weeks, just like we were spraying every 2 to 3 weeks. You're going to want to work your ground every 2 to 3 weeks because that's just about how much time it takes for like those new growth noxious weeds in there to get growing again, and then you have to do something with them. So the spray timeline and the plow, disc, till timeline are the same. So you can go back and look at that same timeline if you're trying to plow, disc, or till, and then follow that as well. And it's just a way to take care of it without chemicals, although you might have to do it more than 3 times. 3 times with use of chemicals is more than enough to make sure you're going to be weed-free heading into the season. But depending on, like I said, especially if this is a newer, untouched part of ground, 3 times of plowing, disking, or tilling might not be enough. You might have to do more. Now, yes, I would highly recommend doing that summer cover crop, even if that summer cover crop is initially competing with other noxious weeds in there. It grows so much faster and so much lusher that it'll grow and then choke out all of those weeds in there. And it's just another way that if you guys are dead set on not using chemicals, please, I would recommend then doing that summer cover crop just so that you can head weed free into the season. And then when that gets terminated, you're going to crimp that buckwheat down. That will lay like a thatch on top too. So it's going to kind of continue to choke out those weeds immediately after you terminate it. But I would guess that you're not going to have a completely weed-free plot. And weeds are okay to some extent. Yes, deer eat weeds, but those weeds die, wither, and fade away well before the season is through, and those fall-focused food plot seeds that we planted stay booming into the hunting season. So your food plot's not going to be as attractive if it had weeds in it, because it's going to sort of die off. Those weeds will die off as they head into fall. Whereas your fall-focused food plot seeds are going to continue to boom, and then now they can't really fill back into that area that was taken away by those weeds earlier in the season. So now that I've told you guys how you can get your food plots established with chemicals and without chemicals, I'm going to tell you what I do, and it's kind of a mix of both. Now, I am not against using chemicals, but chemicals are expensive, and I'm always looking for ways to keep my costs down. And speaking of that, I will leave a link down in the description of where I have found the cheapest chemicals this year if you do want to use them. So what I do is I do that first spraying. I hit the plot up with glyphosate and 2,4-D. And now the reason why I do that is, yes, to deal with the weeds, but because I have established food plots. I was just out on my southeastern Wisconsin food plot today, and my brassicas are starting to grow again. So over March here in southeastern Wisconsin, we got hit with over 1.5 feet of snow throughout a couple snowstorms. And so the deer would go off, and as we had lost our snow cover, they were finding things to eat in the woods again, and they didn't really need to hit up that food plot. But we get hit with those 3 big snowstorms, and those deer would pound that food plot. And so those brassicas were already pretty heavily browsed because of just winter and the deer not having much to eat. And that is a good thing to plant in your food plots because it does help them get through the winter. But so they were hitting those up, but then as we were heading into March, we lost our snow. They were eating every bud and whatever else out in the woods, pounded the red osier dogwood, of course. But they would come and they would pound those brassicas again every time we got a snowfall. So they had those nipped down basically all the way down to nothing after those 3 snowstorms. But then now that we're hitting spring green up, those brassicas are starting to leaf out again, starting to grow again. And so I will hit them up with one treatment of chemicals to terminate them once and for all, so that I'm not taking them into the next growing season. And now some of you might ask, like, why would you terminate them just to plant more? Now, the thing is I do like to rotate my brassicas, so they'll be on the other side of the plot this year than they were last year. And that's just to keep my soil right in my plots. But the other thing is, if I were to let those brassicas grow from here on out, they're going to be old and just not attractive to the deer come fall hunting season. And we, of course, are focused on the fall hunting season. So I'll let them grow here. I'll let the deer have a snack out there until we get a little bit further into spring green up here, so that they have more than enough food out there. And then I'm going to go in, just like I said, probably end of April, and I'm going to hit that plot up with 1 spraying of glyphosate and 2,4-D to just finally kill everything that's out there. And so what will happen then is I'll just keep an eye on it. I'm not going to spray again in 3 weeks. I'll go see and make sure that a lot of things aren't growing in there, but because it's been an established food plot, I don't get a lot of other growth out there. But what I will do is I will go out there with a cultivator. Now, this is not no-till then, because I'm obviously using equipment to turn over the ground, but I will use a cultivator without any weight on the back of it. I'll let it kind of just bounce along the top of the dirt. And what that does is it kind of just busts up that very, very top layer. It gives my soil a little bit of like air in it. It aerates it just a little bit. And it, of course, is going to beat apart like anything I had planted in there last year. It's going to get me better seed to soil contact when I want to go spray, which is ideally what I'm looking for. So I kind of treat my weeds with cultivating, but also with chemicals. And I just keep an eye on which will work better for me. But what seems to work best for me, what all I had to do last year was 1 spray and 1 time cultivating. And then I threw down a summer cover crop last year. I'm not 100% sold on if I'm going to do a summer cover crop this year. That soil is so good now in that plot that I really don't need to do it for like the green manure effect that it gives. I would only be doing it just to like choke off any weeds that would grow throughout the summer, so that I can plant my fall focused seeds into a weed-free plot. So if I'm not going to do a summer cover crop, I'm probably going to spray once here right after spring green up to just terminate like those old brassicas and anything else in there. I would wait till further into the season before that fall plant date and probably spray 1 more time and then cultivate and just get everything beat up out there, that nice seed to soil contact. Otherwise, if we do summer cover crop, we keep with the same schedule I said before, but skipping some of those spraying, which just goes to show, like I was saying, the longer you guys do this food plot stuff, the less chemicals you typically have to use. So if you guys are looking for some cheap chemicals, go check them out down in the description. If you feel like you got some value from this video, go ahead, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, leave me a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this video, YouTube thinks you're going to enjoy this one too, so go check that out, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.